Today I'm sharing my 10 weaving tips to make your weaving experience faster, easier, and overall a whole lot better. If that sounds interesting to you, then stick around.
Yesterday there was sun and there was rain, beauty in the mundane, and as the light startled.
Hey everyone, Jellica here from aprettyfix.com and welcome back to my channel. Well, I love weaving and I love to share all of my techniques, tips, and tricks. But if I am really honest, there are times where it can be a little bit of an irksome process. And oftentimes it comes down to three things: either a lack of tools, or it could be tools that you do have that just aren't really working for you. And let's just face it, weavers err. So I just want to share with you some of those things that I've learned over the years. So without further ado, let's get into it. Tip number one is to purchase a long, rigid tapestry needle. You know, I've used a lot of tapestry needles over the years, and I would say that the one quality that I look for now is one that is long and one that is rigid. And here's why. When you have a tapestry needle that has too much flex in it, when it bends, like this long plastic one, it makes weaving your horizontal rows much more challenging because you're having to compensate with your wrist and your fingers to try to get that yarn across. So a long, rigid tapestry needle is the way to go. It's all sort of up to the weaver to determine what the best length is. But definitely a rigid tapestry needle is the way to go. Tip number two, besides having a long, rigid tapestry needle, you're also going to want to invest in a small bent tip needle like this one here, or this one right here. This one's a metal one, and this one's a plastic one. So in this case, plastic works fine for these shorter ones. And what do you use a bent tip needle for? I use this for two purposes. One is to kind of finish off my weaving at the end when I'm sort of taking all of those dangly bits and weaving in my extra yarn at the back end of my weaving. The bent tip itself just really helps you get under those pieces of yarn. It really helps you glide in there a little bit easier. And the second purpose that a bent tip needle serves for me is to create smaller stitches in my weaving, like the hem stitch here that I demonstrated on the channel. For finishing off a weaving, I will leave a link in the description box for that if any of you are interested. It's a versatile little weaving needle that just makes the whole process a lot easier. Tip number three is to have large open baskets on hand. You know, for me, as much as I love my craft room, I'll leave a link in the description box below if you guys haven't seen my whole craft space. But as much as I love it, sometimes I just want to weave somewhere else in the house. And I want to be able to make myself mobile. So I love these large open baskets where I can just toss all of my yarn, everything that I need, grab my loom, and then I just go upstairs and weave upstairs. I have these kind of pieces that I've just found when I was thrifting. So large open baskets, who knew? Tip number four is all about creating fringe at various lengths. Typically when you're actually creating fringe on your weaving loom, you have pre-cut lengths of yarn ready, and I always like to use objects that are readily available. If I want to create shorter fringe, I'll use something like a ruler, and I'll just wrap my yarn around the ruler. If I need something that's a little bit longer, which typically I do, I'll just have a book on hand and I will wrap it around a rigid book. Or you can just use some cardboard. You can just wrap the fringe around this. And this is great for having extra long fringe. You just cut it in half and then you have a long length of it available. And don't forget, I often use my hand if I'm creating shorter fringe. I just wrap it around my hand quickly in a pinch. This helps me to create lengths of fringe, and I would encourage you not to buy any fancy equipment. Just have some rulers, books, and cardboard cutouts on hand, and you're good to go. Tip number 5 is to invest in a yarn ball winder. Now, for those of you who have purchased specialty yarns, typically they'll come in these twisted skeins of yarn like this. And these are not very user-friendly. What you'll find when you've kind of untwisted it is that eventually, I'll pull out my untwisted yarn. Eventually you untwist it and you have this long piece like this. And it's really difficult to use because what you'll find is that as you pull on this yarn that it starts to get tangled and it just becomes really unusable. What a yarn ball winder does is it turns this twisted yarn into a usable yarn like this, which is a center pull yarn. And this is how you can create it. This is my yarn ball winder, and it's pretty typical of most. You just attach it to a table, and then you can grab the yarn that you're using and then begin to wind the yarn. To make things a little bit easier, I would recommend just wrapping the yarn around a chair or a couple of chairs. It all depends on the length of the skein. And attaching it is pretty easy. You grab one end and you place it in this slot provided, and then you just begin to wind the yarn, and it starts to create a ball around the nozzle that you can see there. And typically it only takes me a couple of minutes to create one full ball before it needs to be removed. And removing it is pretty easy. You just slide the ball off the nozzle and then wrap the yarn that's on the outside of the ball, just kind of tuck it in to the side, and then you've got that center pull feature that just makes it so much easier to use your yarn without any more tangling. Tip number 6 is all about keeping your warp string spool under control as you are warping your loom. Now, I don't know any weaver who does not have the problem of keeping their warp string spool under control when you are warping your loom, when you're pulling on the string and you're trying to warp and it just starts to roll away on you. So I have 2 different tips for you. One is if you have a small enough spool or a large enough jar to put your spool in the jar, and that way when you're pulling on the warp string, the actual spool just stays in the jar. The other tip is that if you are able to purchase spools that come in this kind of cone shape, I do find that these are a little bit easier to use. You're able to kind of control it to some extent because it's got a really nice base. But between the two, the jar just contains the spool a little bit better and is far more easier to control. Tip number 7 is all about keeping a ruler or a tape measure on hand when you weave. When I first started weaving, I didn't really have a lot of understanding or a lot of control over the weaving tension. Sometimes my woven rows were a little bit tighter, sometimes they were looser, but I did find that having a ruler on hand where I could kind of measure along the way, not every row by any means, but every couple of inches, I would kind of measure to make sure that the width of my weaving was relatively even, and I just found it very, very helpful. While this might seem small or insignificant, I did find that it was a very helpful thing to have on hand, and it really did help me to become a better judge of my weaving tension and my weaving process overall. Tip number 8 is all about having a little handy dandy mini iron to kind of iron out, so to speak, any kind of minor weaving fails, which can happen when we're removing our weaving from the loom. It can be a bit deceptive. You think that you've got everything all lined up, and then when you remove that weaving, you realize, oh, it's a little wobbly here, or I didn't create enough balance in this space here. What I might recommend to you is to use a mini craft and sewing iron. A couple of tips for using irons on your weaving, depending on the materials that you're using, is always treat your weaving as a delicate piece, like a blouse or fine linen. And so what I always do is I will use a damp piece of linen, like an old pillowcase, and then I'll place this on top of the weaving, and then I'll use my mini iron to just press on the piece, just to relax the yarn a little bit and widen it out in those areas that I thought were a little bit more narrow. So this is really intended as a way to fix little areas of your piece. My goal always is to touch it the least amount of times after I've removed it from the loom, and just allow it to bend and flex in a natural way. But if you do need to kind of relax it in a couple of areas, then I would recommend something like this to kind of iron out those little areas that need a little extra attention. Tip number 9, and speaking of irons, this steamer is a really great thing to use when you want to create straight fringe. Then I would recommend using something like a steam iron to actually steam and relax the fringe. And you would use this as you would on any other piece of fabric and allow the steam to then relax that yarn. So again, another really handy piece to have, add to your weaving arsenal. And tip number 10 is all about minimizing back pain. For those of you who have been weaving for any length of time, you know that repetitive motion will often create upper or lower back pain. And I want to give you some tips to kind of reduce that weaver's back pain. So for those of you who are lap loom weavers, then what I would recommend is that you shift positions. And there are 3 different positions that you can shift into. You can either have it on your lap, just as it's intended, and lean it against the table. So it's at a 45-degree angle, and then you can just weave away in front of you. The second position is to actually take your loom and place it flat on a tabletop. And to prevent the loom from sliding around on the tabletop, I always put some painter's tape on the back, and it really does secure it to the table quite nicely. And then the third position is to actually place this on a tabletop easel. Or you can use a floor easel like I do, and it's just a nice way to kind of shift positions while I'm weaving. If you are somebody who uses a slightly larger loom, then you will no doubt have a loom that looks pretty much like this one, with legs that allows the loom to stand up, and you can place it on a table, or you can place it on the floor if it's a particularly large loom. So it allows you to shift positions again. You can either be standing as you weave, or you can be sitting as you weave. The stool is a fantastic find. It's just something that I purchased on Amazon, and I'll leave a link for that as well. But for those of you who have extra large looms, much larger than the one I'm using, I would say a good stool to help support your back would be an absolutely essential thing to have. If you are wondering about the loom that I am using, this happens to be a handmade nail loom, the tutorial of which is actually on my blog, and I will leave a link in the description box for you to be able to check that out. I absolutely love it. I've been using it for years. Well, I really hope that these weaving tips have helped you in some small way, whether you are new to weaving or you've been weaving for a long time. Making these minor adjustments or investing in a few additional tools, I believe will really increase your enjoyment of the whole weaving process. If you did enjoy the video, then please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel. And I will see you all in the next video. Well, hello, Mr. Burger. Are you a YouTube cat? Oh, aren't you? Aren't you just?